I want to introduce this wonderful program tonight. We have Foster Hirsch, who is also a lamb, who is going to interview David Rothenberg.
It's my pleasure to introduce the legendary David Rothenberg, who was a theatrical publicist, an author, Fortune Society, producer, all about man about town of New York, and he's here to talk to us about his terrific new book, Manhattan Mayhem. The legendary David Rothenberg.
Is this on?
Yeah.
I was first at the Lambs Club in 1960. Bert Wheeler took me. 4 people know who he is.
Yeah, Bert Wheeler, Rubber Woolsey.
Can you hear David, or his mic isn't on?
Now it's on. Is it on? No. Oh, you missed all the good stuff.
Magda, could you check?
What is this strange thing here?
That's another, that's what I wanted.
It's almost obscene.
Try now.
I now have 2 microphones. Neither are working.
That's fine.
It's okay? Can you hear David?
Now you can hear me.
Now you can hear David.
I'm ready to leave.
No.
No, I said that I had been to the Marsha Jean Kurtz has just entered. And there, your co-star from Marsha Jean, your co-star from Viet Rock. Marsha, your co-star from Viet Rock, Jordan Charney. Jordan and his wife Nancy and I produced it, and that's when I first met Marsha Jean. And anyway, I said that I first went to the old Lambs Club, 44th Street. They had a beautiful theater. Bert Wheeler was in an off-Broadway show, and I was the 18th assistant press person, and he took me to the Lambs. And
that was your first time.
That was my first time.
And now you're the focus of
And
the
now-
evening.
yeah.
So I'm going to start by talking about your book, but then
Oh, I want to talk before you. I want to take over.
No, you can't. I'm the interviewer tonight. You have to follow my pattern.
But
David has been the interviewer for over 50 years, and he knows how to run an interview. He interviewed me about my book. But you know what, guys? I'm the boss tonight. I'm the boss, David. I will make you look good.
He thinks he is.
I'm going to make you look
No,
good.
all I wanted to say is because you're a film historian and a film writer, I had decided to say something shocking. I wanted to tell you the movie stars who I never got. When I say never got, I don't know why they're stars. So I'm going to tell you who they are. There are 3 women and about 5 men.
You already told me, but I'll play dumb.
Marlene Dietrich, Claudette Colbert, and Greta Garbo. If I were an agent or a producer, I would have never hired them, which shows you how much I can recognize talent. The men, John Wayne, Robert Mitchum, Fred McMurray, and then this is the killer for everybody, Gary Cooper. I don't get it.
Okay, well, that's it. No accounting for taste,
No.
I guess.
But in college I saw a B movie and I said, why isn't that woman getting better parts? And everybody said, what are you talking about? And I said, Anne Bancroft has more than they're showing up in Hollywood. So I have some.
You were right about that,
Yes.
for sure.
All right, now
Okay,
go ahead, now interview me.
Now we'll start the interview. Manhattan Mayhem is a book of short stories that David wrote during the pandemic. And reading the stories, of course, I was always asking myself, how much is fiction, how much is truth, and how did you blend the two?
Is that a question?
That
or
is
you-
a question.
That was a declarative statement.
But there was a question at the end of it.
Well, I don't. When people say it's all fiction, it's all my imagination. How can you imagine something if you hadn't seen it in some way? So, some of those stories are out and out fact. The one about my family, "Oi, do I remember Mama," is my mother. But stories, the Fortune Society inspired 2 stories, and I fictionalize them for obvious reasons. One is a very painful tale about a family that ended up in the witness protection program, and people don't know what happens to people because they're not allowed to talk about it. And I met that was 50 years ago, but I met one of the children 50 years later and learned about what the family goes through and the horror of it. It's very dramatic, and that's a story called The Uninvited.
And the devastation and the loneliness.
Yes, but I've changed. I was very careful because I thought the mafia would come and get me to find out. But as I kept telling the child at the age of, when he was I gave the gender away, the person, I kept saying everybody involved in this case is long since gone. So, but somebody who grows up in a witness protection program lives a life of fear and not being able to talk about it to anyone. And his family moved from town to town. Can you imagine a Brooklyn family moving to Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, and something in Alabama, and Fayetteville, Arkansas, and they had to keep moving, and the children were not allowed to make friends.
But did you have a meeting with the daughter or granddaughter of that person, or is that fictionalized?
No. The person, one of the child, who is now a grown person, came to me, and I said, "Why, you're telling me all this?" And they said, "You were there, and you knew my dad, and you knew my family, and you knew what we were going through." And it was almost therapeutic or cathartic, because I learned that this individual could never talk about it to anyone.
But talked about it
But
to you.
could talk about it to me, and it was very painful to listen. The father, the man who ended up in the witness protection program, was a man I loved, and I introduced him to his wife and was godfather for one of the children, for one of his kids. And
Does the woman know that it's now a story in your book? Okay.
Oh, May, I don't know. I don't think so.
Okay. What a number of your stories reminded me of, because of the New Jersey setting and the Jewish background. And don't laugh.
What do you think's Jewish? Who's Jewish?
Philip Roth.
What?
Philip Roth.
Oh, thank you.
Some of
I
your-
could do better. I mean, worse.
You could do a lot worse. Some of your stories reminded me of Philip Roth in terms of the Jewish extended family and the affectionate and satiric treatment of Jewish manners. You have to be Jewish to get all of the flavor of it, but you suggest what a Jewish family is like. I grew up like you, with a mother who played mahjong, and I will always hear 4 crack, 2 bam for the rest of my life. You quote that in your book, and I thought he's writing about what I know.
Well, my sister and I used to sit on the landing and compile all the comments the women were making to each other so we could impersonate them to my father the next morning. My mother was not thrilled by that. Can I tell them one story?
Please.
It's in one of the stories about. Was that Marcia?
Yeah.
Put on the. It's right up here. One of my favorite stories is among family folklore goes down from generation to generation. And my sister told me this story. She said, "Do you remember?" And I can't remember the exact names. Belle and Sam Levine from where Grandma lived in the Bronx. And how could I remember them? And she said, "What you have to know is that," I said, "all I remember is that they were all pinched my cheeks." And she said they were swingers. And I said, he swung, he could hardly walk up the steps. and it was revealed because a couple from the concourse came to the tenement and rang 5B instead of 6B and got Etta and Lou instead of Bella and Sam.
Oh.
And so the whole tenement knew the story. And when my grandparents were told the story at length that Belle and Sam, or whatever their names were swingers, Grandma's comment was, "But she was such a good baker."
That was her comment.
Yeah.
Along the same lines, one of the most memorable passages in the book, and one of the funniest, is all the news and hubbub about Edna's new nose.
Oh yeah, that's real.
That's real.
The first woman in Teaneck who had a nose job, and nobody was supposed to talk about it. And I was about 8 and was fascinated, and I kept wondering where the other part of the nose went. And I think I did an impersonation of Jimmy Durante at the house singing. What did I sing? I said, because it was Jimmy Durante with a big nose. That's why I did it. My mother was horrified, and she ordered me on the street never to talk about family things in front of people. And then the next day was on the phone telling everybody how funny I was. We're not going to talk theater at all?
We're going to talk plenty, but I want people to know how good this book is, because
He wants to establish that I'm Jewish.
But that you established without any doubt in the book. But I want people to buy the book. But another moving moment in the book, because the book struck a lot of chords for me. I'm a Jewish fellow too.
I never noticed.
You never noticed, okay. And I grew up with a mahjong player and with the same gestalt. The interview or the meeting you had with your mother's last friend, 99 years old, in a nursing home.
Yeah,
she was the last of
that's
the group.
real. That's real.
That's real.
Yeah,
that felt
It
real.
was my friend Arnie's mother, Pearl. When I went to visit him in Denver, he said, "Would you want to see my mother?" And I said, she was like a second mother to me, and she cried and cried when she saw me, and that was very poignant.
I had a meeting like that with my mother's last remaining friend, 103, Salty. And I said, "Florence, may I take you to dinner?" She said it would just be another meal.
But those are the women that shaped me. My mother's friends, they were all very, they all were involved in things. That we were in the suburbs in Jersey, but there was, they knew what was happening politically. They went to the theater once a month with the winning money from the Mahjong Club. They went to a Wednesday matinee. They were involved with community things, with school things. They were very hip. They were, and I think what I came to the realization, these are all women that was pre-women's movement who were unfulfilled in their lives. The marriages weren't really spectacular. I think that they were, I think they stayed active, but they were unfulfilled, and their great talents were never realized because
But they were activists in a way.
Yes, but they would, and they were involved with their kids, but they were probably 3 generations too early, and I came to appreciate that years later when I started meeting women coming out of the movement who were being fulfilled with their potential.
But these women led up to that in a way. You present them
Yes.
as engaged in their own way in life and environment and keeping active.
Yes.
And keeping active. Now, there's a few stories that touch on your theater career, but indirectly. There's a power couple that I'm sure based on the real people.
Oh, yeah.
You would love to know who they are, but
I'll whisper to you later.
it was what the French call a mariage de convenance. It was
I went to school with him.
But he was sexually active with men, and she accepted that. And
They
was
had-
active,
they had a-
But they were a power couple.
I call them marriage Manhattan style. They were a power couple, well known on the society pages, and they loved each other, except that he had a male inamorata, and she had a male inamorata. It worked for them. And we know many theater couples. I don't think it's any secret about Catherine Cornell and
Guthrie McClintock.
McClintock and Mary Martin and Richard Halliday. It worked. I don't know about Carol Channing's husband, but it worked. And who's to judge?
So
Me.
They're no longer here though. That couple.
No, and they were wonderful people. And I surreptitious. Well, I was close to them. And they brought me into a world of social. They were a Fifth Avenue penthouse couple. you'd have dinner there with Pulitzer Prize winning authors and ambassadors, and they were well connected, and they were wonderful people. It's just that their sexual private life would not be on Leave It to Beaver.
Okay.
Or the Brady Bunch.
You do mention Fortune Society directly and indirectly in
Part of
in
my
the
life.
memoirs, a big part of your life.
Yeah.
But do you trace your activist spirit from your family? I mean, you're an activist. That's your description.
Well,
Theater publicist,
my-
activist.
No, I think my activism. I went to the University of Denver. Now, why would a kid from Teaneck go to Denver in the 50s? Because it was far away, and it was the best thing I ever did. And I guess my instincts were there, but I immediately became. I was not an activist in high school, but I was in college, and I love talking about it. My freshman year, the end of my freshman year, I was chosen by the Students for Democratic Action, which was the ADA student affiliation, to go to D.C. for the summer with a group of students. I discovered that Washington, D.C. in the 50s, it was a southern segregated city, and we were a mixed group, and so we stayed in the black section of town, and I saw what segregation was. And a man named George Hauser came and spoke to us one night, and I'm reading the biography of Bayard Rustin now, and I found out that George Hauser and Bayard Rustin were partners at the Fellowship of Reconciliation as pacifists and civil rights activists, and he trained us. He asked for volunteers to do sit-ins. This is 1952, way before sit-ins were prevalent, and we were at the People's Drug Store in D.C. at the DuPont Circle every Sunday, white and black kids asking for a cup of coffee, and we would trained on how to respond nonviolent if we were hit violently. And the only experience I had is a little old white lady coming out of church, spit in my face, and yelled, "Nigger lover," and I was remember what I was taught, and the spit just dribbled down my face, and that's well, one of the kids said, "That's your Medal of Honor," and I think I saw in that woman's face, first I saw hate, but I think I saw fear, and I think that cemented my feeling that I wanted to be part of making change, and that I could do something, that I didn't have to just complain about it, that I could do something.
But your activist spirit must have come from the family as well. They didn't interfere with that. They didn't try to squelch that in you.
No, but after I came back from Attica during, there was a riot in '71, inmate uprising, and I was one of the observers. My mother was not thrilled by my attendance at that. No, I don't think that my grandmother. No, my family did not. They weren't activists.
They were not.
No, they were too busy with family. Their instincts were good. I would say they were politically liberal, without marching for it.
So you took it 1, 2, 3, 4 steps further.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes. Now, there's a wonderful story in which you are a spy at churches that were reputedly anti-Semitic
And racist.
and you were undercover as
In college.
not Jewish.
Well, we were. My friend Nancy Kaler and I, we had met in Washington that summer, and we went back to Denver. She had just finished at the University of Nebraska, and we were a young couple. And this woman asked us if we would go into these two churches, which were racist. Harvey Springer was in one, and we went in as a young couple to report back on what they were saying, what he was saying. And he was talking about international Jewish conspiracy and immigrants, Mexican immigrants he was going after. And the people in it, I always, after I read Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, The Banality of Evil, I understood that because the people that were there. Is that my mother calling? The banality of evil was what I saw. And the people they would talk about gardening and their children going to school, but they were supporting and giving money to a man who was raising money for a radio station to perpetuate racism and anti-Semitism.
But your cover was blown pretty quickly.
Very quickly, because they had spies they caught me at a Unitarian potluck supper.
Oh. So you couldn't continue in that role.
Not after 3 weeks, we were finished.
Okay, now, I did want to say, because I read every word of this book, and you have a voice as a writer, David, and I would encourage you to write more, because this isn't what you've done.
Do you think I have a future?
You have a voice as a writer. I encourage you to read
I
these
can hardly get through the day. How can I have a future?
I think you do, but I know you took these stories up as an occupation during the pandemic.
Yes.
But there's an authorial voice here that has
Thank you.
power.
I have to learn. Stanley Richards at Fortune says I have to learn how to say thank you and be gracious, and stop deflecting compliments with humor. That's an old Jewish trait, I
Well,
think.
you hear David accepted the compliment.
Yes. So let's talk.
Now let's talk.
Let's talk theater.
Now let's talk theater. Let's talk theater. Actually,
I dated. Everybody knows now that I dated Elizabeth Taylor.
Your most famous
My
moment
most
is
famous-
you were Elizabeth Taylor's date for the opening night of Hamlet in 1964.
In
Is that
Toronto.
correct?
In Toronto.
Not in New York.
In '63, no, my date in New York was with Sheila Graham.
Oh, right, you mentioned that, yes. But
Nobody knows who Sheila Graham is anymore. Deborah Carr played her in the movie version, Beloved Infidel, because she had a big affair with F. Scott.
yes, and her daughter Wendy teaches with me at Brooklyn College.
So they
So
go.
there you go.
figure. But should I tell the? Is there anybody here who hasn't heard the Elizabeth story? All right.
Doesn't matter. We want to hear it again.
All right. Show business history. 1962. Elizabeth is signed to play Cleopatra, and is the first woman that gets $1 million for a movie. She was the reigning queen of the cinema, and beautiful. And Stephen Boyd and Rex Harrison were the two leading men, and they were filming in England, and then the weather was terrible, and they moved it to Rome, and Stephen Boyd was replaced by a wonderful Welsh actor named Richard Burton. Richard was married to Sybil Burton, and Elizabeth inexplicably was married to Eddie Fisher. There was no E! Channel in those days, but we did have the Journal American, the Mirror, and the Post, and the News, and word came back that there was heat on the set of Cleopatra, and Richard and Elizabeth startlingly left Sybil, because she had gone through all of his affairs, and he always came back, and she understandably left Eddie, and then when the movie ended, they went to Puerto Vallarta, where he was filming
Night of the
Iguana with Ava and Sue Lyons, and the paparazzi was all over the place. And at that point, Alex Cohn, the producer who I was working with, said to me, "We're doing Hamlet. John Gielgud's directing, Richard Burton starring, and you're going to deal with the press." Egad, says I, the press, the mob squad. So it was determined that they would rehearse in Toronto to lessen the impact of the paparazzi. And in December of '63, I arrived in Toronto to face about 200 people picketing the hotel. The Legion of Decency were picketing because Richard and Elizabeth were living together in sin, outside of marriage. It was called a shanda. I'll tell you what a shanda is later. It's an old Jewish expression, but you're learning the Jewish expression. No, he is. He's learning them from me. And Alex said to me, "Well, when they clear the dining room, which took hours, we'll have lunch." And I went down, and I'm joining John Gielgud, Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor, and Alex Cohn. What's wrong with that picture? So the first thing they want to know, what's with the press? And I said, well, we don't have to. do anything. We're sold out everywhere. But Richard, I've set up with your okay a cover on Life magazine, which ain't bad, because I called Tom Prideaux at Life and said we're opening in April in New York, and Billy Shakespeare's celebrating his 400th birthday. What better cover for Shakespeare's birthday than Richard Burton's Hamlet? And he agreed, and Richard agreed. And I said, here, Richard, everybody else, the whole world wants to talk to you. John Springer and I can get together and work around your schedule. At which point they started talking about the production, and Elizabeth turns to me and says, oh, honey, they don't need us. Why don't we go sit over there? Oh, okay. And I'm sitting with this breathtaking international film star who really was, the beauty was, it was breathtaking. But the most extraordinary thing happened. Within 5 minutes, I thought I was talking to a girl I had gone to high school who was trying to fill in about what I've been doing. How'd you get this job? You're so young. I was 27 at the time. I looked 12. Where'd you go to school? How'd you study all of this? And suddenly I'm not talking to an international beauty film star. I'm talking to this nice girl who's might have been in my psych class in college, you know. So she said, you know, this is all new for Richard. I've never been able to go out. You know, Richard could always bar hop. She said, I can't go anywhere. Are you going to be around during the rehearsal period? And I said, pretty much. I'm going back and forth. And she said, can we hang out? And oh, okay. And there's a play was playing in London, and they filmed it, and I was invited to see
The Motive and the Cue.
The Motive and the Cue.
I saw it.
I couldn't get to it because I couldn't find my passport, but I was going to go to the...
It's a good play.
Yeah, well, I saw the film version of it, and there's one scene where Elizabeth is in the hotel room saying, I'm bored, and I yelled out at the screen, not bang on the pipe, I'm on the floor below.
But you're not a character in the play.
No, I'm not. But Billy Redfield is, and because my first book, he says, is the playwright references me in the printed version. So I figured he read my part about working.
Did your opinion of Elizabeth Taylor change in the course of your knowing her?
No, she was a delight. I was thrilled to. I was just thrilled to be with her.
And her mood didn't change. She treated you
No, I remember
beautifully.
I remember one night to talk about name dropping. I was with Richard and Elizabeth, and we were waiting for a car. And Richard turned to me and said, "Why doesn't Alex have the car here?" And Elizabeth said, "Richard, that's not David's job." And I said, "Yeah, good for you."
Was that your most renowned production?
No, Fortune in Men's Eyes was.
In a different way.
In a different way.
In a different way.
I think Hair was a big deal. Viet Rock was a big deal, wasn't it, Jordan? Marsha Jean? Yes. It was the first anti-war play. Megan Terry wrote this, and it was Nancy will never forgive me because I insisted we invite the critics, and it was too early to be so against the war, but it was a very good play with music that was against the Vietnam War. And then Fortune in Men's Eyes was the next play, and that changed my life and out of the theater. And that's when the activism came in, and and I always, the thing that happened with Hamlet is when any of you old enough to remember the Hamlet on Broadway? Or
yes.
Anybody old enough to admit it?
There was a film of
every
it.
night in New York.
There was a film.
Pardon me?
There was a film of the Hamlet.
Yes.
Yeah,
and a record, and my reporting on it. But there was every night in New York. It came down at about 11:15. In those days, curtain was 8:30, and every other show got out, and the crowd on every other show, the audiences came to 46th Street to get a glimpse of Elizabeth, who came every night to pick up Richard, and so it was a crowd hysteria. And when it went from Toronto to Boston, I was the advanced person, got knocked out by the cops.
Mm-hmm.
I had all the papers, and the cops that were standing there blocking the crowd, and they said, "Where are you going, kid?" And I said, "I'm the advanced man." "You're not going anywhere." And I got punched in the stomach and woke up in the first aid room. And the plane had to go into the hangar because no one knew where to go. And I brought out the papers, and one of the nurses says, "He is the advanced man." And anyway, that wasn't theater for me. That was another world. And I left New York and took a freighter to Italy and lived in Rome because I had worked on an Italian musical called Brugantino. And I was wined and dined by the Italian cognoscenti, all the theater people, movie people that I worked with, who were wonderful hosts for me. And I was actually offered a job. Pietro Garone, who was the head of the Teatro Sistina, arranged for me to meet Dino De Laurentiis. And I was offered a job to be the American PR person, coordinator. And I had to decide whether I wanted to live in Rome, which I loved, but I thought, I'm an American, and I want to go back, and I want to do theater that matters. And Fortune in Men's Eyes, I didn't know anything about prison when I read it, but the actors wanted to go to Rikers Island, and I went with them, and I saw the insanity and the destruction of lives. And the play was about a boy who goes to prison who's ostensibly an innocent. He's guilty of the crime he committed, but he's ostensibly an innocent, but the system changes. And at the end of the play, were you around then?
Yes,
the end
I
of the
was,
play,
yes.
Terry Kaiser looks out at the audience and says, "I'm going to get back at them. I'm going to get back at you all." And that was the statement of the play, is that the system creates antisocial violence. And when the play was running, a professor, you want the story? The professor said, "Can we stay afterwards to talk to the actors about the play?" And that was right up my alley. Theater as a mirror of a social obscenity. And people were questioning it. The audience wanted to stay because it was a very intense production, and people wanted to talk about it. And a man challenged its authenticity. And from the back of the house, a guy stood up and said, "Well, if my 20 years in joints like this counts for anything, you people couldn't watch it." And I said, "Come on down," like Johnny Olson used to do. And Pat McGarry came down and mesmerized the audience for an hour. And we went across the street to the Limelight. And I said, "Pat, you have to come back next week and tell this story again." And he said, "Everybody knows this." And I said, "No, they don't. I don't, and I'm pretty hip." And he said, "Well, I did white time. You got to get a black guy." And I said, "Black time? White time?" He said, "Well, Rikers Island, this is in the 60s. He said, they had white wings and black wings." And I said, "Jesus." And I said, "I don't know anybody." And he said, "Well, I work in a tailor shop, and I have a customer." He said, "We don't talk about it, but we can read each other." And he came back with a guy named Clarence Cooper, African American. And we were doing that for weeks. And because I was a good press agent, I called Cy Peck at the Times, who had a great political, social conscience. And he sent a reporter down, and the headline was, "The drama continues after the curtain falls." And it said, every Tuesday night, two men who have been in prison reflect on the reality of the play. And the next Tuesday night, Gesundheit.
Thank you.
And the next Tuesday, God bless you. And the next Tuesday night, there must have been 20 guys there that had done time, that introduced themselves. And we all went across the street and had
But the
talk.
power of that play, and I did see it, was that you wanted to discuss
Yes,
afterwards.
you had to.
The play itself wasn't the complete evening.
No.
It almost demanded a discussion.
But when I had the large group across the street, these were guys who were almost all in AA, and they were all working, and they all were living somewhere. But I realized, or they told me, that they were all lying, that if it was known they were working false names, or they lied, and none of them could sign the leases that they had. And I, one night, in great innocence, said, "Well, when does the punishment stop?" And they all yelled at me, "It's for life." And I said, "I don't get it." And I started talking to some of the guys who were very intense about these experiences. And I said, if your stories are unknown, because the only time we ever saw people who had been in prison in those days, if they had a paper bag over their head and they would testify, I said, your stories we could educate the public with your stories. And the next Tuesday night at the theater, I said, we're going to start an organization to give a voice to the voiceless. and 16 people gave me $2, and we opened a bank account at Chemical Bank, which we outlived, had a $32 bank account, and the Fortune Society, 57 years later, now has a staff of over 500 people. We have a residence in Harlem called The Castle, and we did a play from that called The Castle. I think Philip Paul is here, he's in the current cast. And we now have 5 more residents. So there will be 1,000 people sleeping in a Fortune bed tonight who would otherwise be homeless. And if you can, the point is that if you're concerned about crime and reducing it, there are answers. But there has to be some passion, commitment, and understanding it. One of the male candidates who doesn't stand a prayer keeps talking about, his name is Zelna Myrie. He keeps talking about after school programs for kids that don't have any place to go after school because they've eliminated after school programs. He said, we're spending $500,000 a year per child on Rikers Island. That's how much it costs to keep one person on Rikers Island. He said if some of that money could be redistributed into the neighborhoods where kids are going to jail and giving them programs, and I know that's true because Fortune has created an alternative to incarceration program, our ATI program, in which we have about 150 teenagers at any given time who could have been in jail, but the judge determined that they would be better off given a shot here. I'll just tell one story and then I'll stop the Fortune. But it's my passion, so forgive me. When the ATI began, Joanne Page, who was the director at the time, said, and I was retired, and I said I wanted to volunteer. She said, run an ATI group. So I went in. That means sit with about 15, 16 little gangsters, teenagers. And I went into the room, and they look at you suspiciously. And by the third day, it's, hey, Dave, what are we going to do today? It was, and you with continuity and consistency and listening to them, you establish a pattern and a trust, and that's the big word, a trust. Kids who have never trusted. And one day I said to them, there's a story in the paper about all the fights on Rikers Island. The causes, the paper said, is gangs and fight over drugs and fight over this. I said, how many of you have been in Rikers Island? And all the hands went up. I said, how many of you have ever been in a fight? And all the hands went up. And I said, why did you fight? And they argued back and forth, and the conclusion was that it broke the boredom, that it was the only interesting thing that happened. And I said, well, you're the same demographics as those kids. And one of the kids says, what's a demographic? And I said, it's you. You're black, you're a teenager, and you've gotten in trouble. That's you. Your demographic is the same as theirs. But we don't have fights. Why not? And before any discussion, one kid yelled out, who has time? And I used those 3 words to tell political people that you keep people active, give them pride in what they're doing, something that is meaningful in their lives. And you might make a difference. It is possible. They don't have a commitment to being in jail and being locked up and hanging out on the street if they see that there's an option. And I say all of this because it started from the theater. And the theater can be the arts can be a powerful mechanism for social change. And I always tell the story that I never understood 6 million Jews till I read the Diary of Anne Frank. And the power of her story made me understand that 1 time multiplied by 6 million is what I was reading.
But when you found the script of Fortune in Men's Eyes, you had no idea that this would be a life-changing experience.
No, I sat in bed and read it, and I wrote a letter to John Herbert, the playwright, and said I felt I was locked in a room with a bunch of cobras, the boys in the play.
Yeah. And this powerful play changed your life. However, you did go back to the theater as
I
a
did,
publicist.
yes.
And you did work on plays that were not life-changing for you or
Oh,
for the audience.
I know who you're leading to.
No, not yet. You know where I'm going, but not yet.
We'll
But
talk about her.
We will, we have to. But you did work on a number of plays that were there for pure entertainment, and you love theater at that level too, am I right?
And
you love going to the theater.
Yes, and the guys at Fortune love nothing more. Well, was that when I came? No, that was, the first 3 years of Fortune, I was still working in the theater. It was all volunteer for 3 years, and I was working on hair at the time. The guys from Fortune loved going to see hair. We'd stand in the back. I'd bring 6 or 8 guys, and
That
we'd
was a
stand
great
in the
show.
back. It was a wonderful show.
Great show.
Diane Keaton was one of the kids. She sat with me on the steps at one of the Wednesday matinees and said, I just had an audition. I think he liked me. And I said, who? She said, Woody Allen. I just auditioned for him. That was rather, what's the word that I want? Begins with a P. It's a big word. Anyway, go ahead.
But what were some of your favorite shows in terms of just pure entertainment? Not
That I worked on or that I saw?
No, that you worked on.
Well, I loved working with Eli Wallach and Ann Jackson. And they did an evening together, which I enjoyed. I enjoyed it because being with them was so nice. John Leguizamo's Mambo Mouth. When I first went to, I was working for the American Place Theater, and they had the big theater and the little theater, and then they had a divan with 40 folding chairs. And Win Hanman said, go to the dress rehearsal. Nobody else wanted to go. This kid, Puerto Rican kid, was going to do some scenes. Well, I thought it was genius what he was doing in Mambo Mouth. And I called Win the next day and I said, you got to pull him out of those folding chairs. Not that anything wrong with folding chairs. And he didn't, it moved to a bigger theater and then it moved off Broadway and John Leguizamo had. But working with him was.
Well, he's a genius, sort of, isn't he?
Genius, but but it was also fun seeing somebody embryonic with their talent and watching it explode.
Did you ever take a job on a show you did not like?
Yes. Well, I didn't know I didn't like it till I saw it.
And you didn't like it?
Yeah. I mean, you read a script and you say, well, I wish them luck. Yeah, there were a few. There was one about St. Francis of Assisi. If he were alive, he would have sued. It was horrible.
It was horrible.
Yes.
But when you represent a show you don't like, do you have to become an actor yourself? Or do you give it away?
Oh, you want the secrets of the trade.
I want
don't
the
you?
secrets of the trade.
Well, with St. Francis of Assisi, you send out the tickets, and then the critics decide whether they want to come or not. And then it's in their ballpark. They took care of it. The worst show I ever worked on, I was the assistant press agent. It was called Bella, not about Bella Abzug. And Walter Kerr wrote in his review, and I can remember, I shall always carry the playbill of Bella in my vest pocket. For at some future date, I'll be sitting in the theater thinking, this is the worst thing I've ever seen. And then I'll tap my vest and remember, oh no, there was Bella. That didn't run long.
Do you have a sense of how a show is going to do
I did with
before it
Bella.
opens? You did with Bella. But you have a sense of it. Are you good at that?
No,
this is going to
sometimes
work. I don't like it, but audiences will like it. Critics will like it.
Well, sometimes they're wrong. I mean, Viet Rock should have run through the whole war. Walter Kerr was critic for the Times then, and he said, if I remember Jordan, Nancy, Marsha, his most telling comment was, it's all right for these young people to be against the war, but must they be so adamant? Is that right? Yeah. And we were selling out at the previews, and the audiences were cheering, all the peaceniks. And Walter Kerr squashed it because in those days, a lot of days, a Times critic could kill a serious play. You could get a long run if you had a Hollywood star or a chorus girl.
It's still true.
Yes. Although George Clooney was pretty good.
I didn't see him.
Oh, it was
He
quite
was good, yeah.
You didn't see it on
No.
CNN either?
No.
Didn't work on television. Anybody see it on CNN? It's too all over the place. They didn't adapt. You can adapt a theater piece for television, but when you film it, as it is on stage, it didn't work if it was a contained play, one scene play, a play like the one that won the Pulitzer, Promise.
Promise. Proposal?
Purpose.
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 It was a P. Purpose.
Yeah, that first act scene at the dinner table is almost O'Neill-ish. It's as if Eugene O'Neill had written it. That could work on television.
Do you ever see a show now and say, "Oh, I'd love to be the representative on that show"?
No. Not because it's not good, because I don't want to have to deal with. I want to go home. I only go to matinees. At night, I watch NBA games, and when it gets
So
late, I watch.
tonight is an exception.
And then I watch, then baseball games now, and then I watch Golden Girl reruns.
But you did.
I'm old. I
Can-
don't want to work on anything now.
You don't want. You have
Well,
no
I-
lure for the theater. The theater doesn't
Oh,
have
I
a lure
love
for
the
you.
theater, but if I have time, my passion is with the Fortune Society.
Not for the theater. Not to work in the
Well,
theater.
no, I mean, what I love most is taking women from Fortune to the theater. I mean, when I took Helen Taylor, who had never, ever been to Ailey, and, well, there's a wonderful story. You all heard of Alvin Ailey? My first friend in the theater, really. I was working for Max Eisen in 1959, and he said, I was stuffing envelopes, and he said, we're doing a summer tour of Jamaica. Abby Lincoln is doing the Lena Horne part, and a kid in the chorus is going to direct the summer tour, and we're having pictures over at the studio. We need somebody from the office to go there. So I went, and there's this intimidating man who's the director, and I said, "Hi, I'm David from the press office." And he said, "Oh, hi, I'm Alvin Ailey from the play." And he started setting up picture scenes. And I said, "Alvin, I was my editor of my college paper, and you have to get them closer together if you want 2-column, 3-column pictures." He said, "Oh, I didn't know all that. Thank you." And so we worked together on it. And afterwards, he said, "Let's get a bite to eat." And so 2 kids in the theater, not knowing where they're going. I'm saying, here's this kid from Texas, a dancer, and we immediately, it was mainly humor because we both got hysterical over the same thing. And I'll always remember the day in those days, those of you who are old enough to remember, there was a time when we were a community. There were no big buildings except for 1501 Broadway, and you'd walk along Broadway and you'd run into everybody was either an actor, a director, an agent, or a producer, and you all knew each other. And I run into Alvin Ailey, and he says, "What are you doing at 2 o'clock today?" Well, when somebody in the business asks you, "What are you doing?" you usually try to make up a lie, because they're trying something out. And if it's awful, you don't want to see it, because what do you tell them? And I couldn't come up with a lie fast enough, and Alvin said, "I've started a dance company, and I'm having a rehearsal upstairs at 2 o'clock today." And I went up there, and nobody else showed up. Everybody else's lies worked. And it was a hot day, and there was no air conditioning, and the dancers were all sweated out for the day with their torn leotards. And he said, "I'm creating a piece from the Bible." And I thought, well, that's the final nail in the coffin. And if you've ever seen Revelations, it's one of the most magnificent theater pieces that you could ever see. And I saw it in that rough stage, and I knew I was in the presence of genius. And so years later, when I took Helen from Fortune to see it, and she cried, and I said, "Why the tears?" And she said, "I couldn't believe anything was so beautiful." And the beauty of it, and it's majestic.
It's very powerful.
And Alvin would, and when Fortune Society started, Alvin did a play called "Call Me by My Rightful Name" with 2 other young actors, Bobby Duvall, and a young woman who, after I saw the play, I went backstage and I said, "Alvin, who is she?" And he said, "Well, I'm glad you like it, because we're all going out together." And it was Joan Hackett. And Joan, Alvin, and David spent a lot of time together. We were all going somewhere, but we didn't know. But when Fortune began, it was told that we should have an advisory council, and the first 2 people were Alvin Ailey and Joan Hackett. And Alvin always made 10 tickets available to his company for Fortune people. And the standard line at Fortune, Kenny Jackson said, when you got out of jail in New York, you get $40, a bologna sandwich, and 2 tickets to Alvin Ailey. And that was wonderful. And Alvin was so proud of that.
Okay, our time is about running up, so we have to.
Oh, you want to get to her?
We have to talk about your climactic experience
My
in the
final
theater.
the final play I worked on in the theater.
And there's a reason it was the final play you worked on.
No, it was going to be anyway, but it would have been if I hadn't played it. It was called Waiting in the Wings, written by a man named Noel Coward, and it starred Rosemary Harris and Betty Persky, known as Lauren Bacall. And now I had worked with divas. I had worked with Betty Davis in Iguana and Peggy Lee for years, and Eartha Kitt, all women who had reputations of being demanding. I never found any of them demanding. I found them professional, wanting people to be professionals that they worked with. And then there was Bacall.
Did she live up to her reputation?
I didn't know there was. Well, she did have a reputation. No, she had a sign on her dressing room door that said nobody permitted 90 minutes before curtain. No one wanted to go in ever. Rosemary Harris was in the other side, and and Rosie was the total opposite. Just a classy act, and a great actress too, I may add. And she's become famous with the kids in some. She's the grandmother. Is it who's Spider-Man?
Spider-Man.
It's like my friend sitting in the back there, Christine Eversole, who. Now, when she first came to Fortune and the teenagers were going crazy, I said, well, they didn't see Grey Gardens. What's going on? And Christine said, what was the name of the movie? Richie Ridge. She played Richie Ridge's mother. And the teenagers all knew her. I didn't know what Richie Ridge was. It was, what's the little boy from Home Alone? Culkin.
Macaulay Culkin.
Macaulay Culkin. And the teenagers at Fortune knew
But
Christine.
Was Bacall's bad behavior the final straw for you, or you were going to quit the business anyway?
No, it wasn't the final straw for me. I mean, listen, it was, I think I'd been around long enough that I couldn't let somebody do that to me. I thought, why was she so unhappy or so unpleasant? She was a cover girl at 16. She got bogey from his wife at 19. She had with a limited amount of talent, had a great scream career. She won a Tony Award, and she was. I ran into Alvin Colt, the costume designer, years later, and I said, "All right, Alvin, we never talked about it. How was it dressing Betty?" And he said, "Oh, a nightmare." And I said, "Why?" And he said, well, because if you ever saw Waiting in the Wings, it's about retired actresses going into a home because they didn't have the wherewithal they had needs. And he got her something simply dressed, and she said, when people come to see Bacall, they want glamour. And he said, well, that's not the part. And she said, well, it will be. When they come to see me, I think he got one of those things that Carol Burnett used for Gone with the Wind parody, one of the drapes. Anyway, I was.
Did you figure out why she was as she
No,
was?
it's a interesting case study. She, listen, when she was in the movies as a young woman, she had a look like no one else. You never said she's another somebody else. Bacall had a look, and it was great. She couldn't act. Howard Hawks was the director.
Howard Hawks.
Directed. If you watch the old movies, he moved her around pretty well. And you looked at her, because she was gorgeous. Why was she so unhappy? It's if I cared enough, I would study about it, but but it is a puzzlement. She was an unhappy woman. She had a great husband. Bogey, I guess, was a good guy, wasn't he? And then she married Jason. But I used to play basketball with one of her sons. He wasn't crazy about her either.
Okay.
I never told him that I had known her.
No, just as a last foray here. What are some of the qualities needed to be successful as a theatrical press agent? What kind of personality do you need? What sort of
Well, I
stance in the world?
I guess I didn't have it because I always remember when Alex Cohn, who was one of the most prolific producers on Broadway, decided he wanted somebody exclusively to handle all his shows, and he couldn't get any of the established PR people. So his wife Hildy said, "Talk to all the young kids that are, the second and third bananas." And he apparently interviewed many people, and I was at Bucks County for the summer, and Mike Ellis said, "Alex should meet you," and he arranged it. And I sat with Alex, and about 10 minutes into the interview, he said, "I want to hire you." And I turned him down. The show was going to be, I don't know whatever happened to those kids. It was called An Evening with Mike Nichols and Elaine May. And I turned it down. I said, I've only been in the business a year and a half. I need more time. But I was told that somebody else, people love coming back and tell you terrible things said about you. And somebody said, when they heard that Alex hired me, why would they hire him? He has a personality like mashed potatoes and doesn't have a creative bone in his body. And I said, well, that's a high compliment, isn't it? But Alex said I said one thing at the interview, and I didn't know what it was. And years later, I said, what? By the way, a year later, I told him I didn't want to work for him, and I would work for other press people. I wanted to work on big Broadway shows. So if I did, and Alex said, I'll wait. And I worked with Betty Davis and Iguana that year, and Julie Harris in Shot in the Dark, and Diane Carroll in No Strings. That was big stuff. And I said to Alex, I'm ready. And the first show was Beyond the Fringe. And who knew that it was going to run for 3 years? And then John Gielgud and Ralph Richardson came in with School for Scandal. I worked with John Gielgud 4 times. My God, that was...
But you asked Alex, what was it about you?
What was it? He said, you're very new in the business, and it's a business of a lot of contacts, and you haven't been around a long time. Why would I hire you? And apparently what I said to him, I may not know someone, but if I have a good idea, that would serve as an introduction, wouldn't it? And he said, I want him.
He liked that.
He liked
that.
Well, because I said, I was right on the top of my head. And years later, he said it was one of the best decisions he ever made. And I was very lucky to have a producer like Alex Cohn to work with. I knew my life would be different when he called me one day and said, Hildy's sick, I'm going to Rome, come fly with me, meet me at Idlewild. And we went to see Rugantino. Another time he took me to London for the opening of Flanders, An Evening with Flanders and Swan. And Binky Beaumont, anybody know who Binky Beaumont was?
Prominent
H.M.
London.
Tennant was the big production firm. Binky said, committed a big old man named Binky. Binky said to me, David, they all were very English. I'm having people over our theater for pheasant under a glass. And I was offended because I thought he said peasant under a glass. And I thought he was making fun of proletariat people. But it was the only time I had pheasant under a glass and the only time I had dinner with Ingrid Bergman. Can you imagine Alex Cohn, me, John Gielgud, Ingrid Bergman, and Mia, her daughter, was a teenager at the time. But sitting having dinner with Ingrid Bergman, I felt like Rick in Casablanca. She was radiant, joyous. So, is this the end?
This is the end.
All right, the book's over there.
The book's over there. David Rothenberg.